Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord has given, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." We'll stand and sing to the Lord's praise the hymn 648. Number 648, I found a friend, oh, such a friend. He loved me ere before I knew him. He loved me ere I knew him. He drew me with the cords of love, and thus he bound me to him. Not that I have my own I call, I hold it for the giver. 648, as Ruth begins to play, let's stand ready to sing. Now I'll read to you in the Old Testament, the book of Leviticus, and chapter 25. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses on Mount Sinai, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I am going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years sow your fields And for 6 years prune your vineyards and gather their crops. But in the 7th year the land is to have a Sabbath of rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. Do not sow your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not reap what grows of itself or harvest the grapes of your untended vines. The land is to have a year of rest. Whatever the land yields during the Sabbath year will be food for you, for yourself, for your manservant and maidservant, and the hired worker and the temporary resident who live among you, as well as for your livestock and the wild animals in your land. Whatever the land produces may be eaten. Count off 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbaths of years amount to a period of 49 years. Then have the trumpet sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement. Sound the trumpet throughout your land. Consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each one of you is to return to his family property, and each to his own clan. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. Do not sow and do not reap what grows of itself, or harvest the untended vines. For it is a jubilee, and is to be holy for you. Eat only what is taken directly from the fields. In this year of Jubilee, everyone is to return to his own property. And there we'll leave it for tonight. We're going to study, if that's the word, the whole of this chapter tonight, Leviticus chapter 25. You know what I'm going to say. The book of Leviticus is all about the tabernacle. By the time you get to the end of Leviticus chapter 9, you can say the tabernacle is the dwelling place of God, and it has now become the tent of meeting, where God meets with his people. At last, the dwelling place of God, the tabernacle, has really become the tent of meeting. You can say that at the end of chapter 9. In chapter 23, the Lord gives to the Israelites all these different Sabbaths. There's the weekly Sabbath day, and there are the other Sabbath days throughout the year, the different Sabbaths. And the thing about the different Sabbaths in Leviticus 23 is that on each one you call a sacred assembly. You call holy convocation at the tabernacle. The people of God must meet with God. They must gather around the Lord at the tabernacle on all the different Sabbaths. Now in chapter 25, there are special times, and one of them is called a Sabbath. But these special times, they're not days, they are whole years. These times are 12 months long, and these special times are not particularly associated with gatherings at the tabernacle. That was so important with all the Sabbaths in chapter 23. That doesn't feature here at all now, gathering at the tabernacle. And the special times of chapter 25 are not going to be observed in the wilderness. They're not going to be observed until the Israelites arrive and settle in the promised land. Now, my Bible, and perhaps yours too, marks out the two different special times of chapter 25 with headings. So there's the Sabbath year, that's verses 1 to 7. There's a heading in my Bible just above verse 1. And then there's the year of Jubilee, and I've got that heading in my Bible above verse 8. The year of Jubilee, and that's described in verses 8 to 55. Takes up all the rest of the chapter. And I'm going to say 2, 3, 4 things about each of these special years. And then I want us to notice what ties the two things together. What is God after from his people when he gives them these two things, seasons, a Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee? So first of all, 3 things about the Sabbath year, as described there in verses 1 to 7. First of all, the Sabbath year is all about the land. It's all about farming. Verse 2, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. It's all about the land and farming. Secondly, there's to be a whole year in which there is no farming. You don't plow the land, you don't work it, you don't sow seed in it, you don't prune what you grow, you don't reap a harvest. So for 6 years you do. Year by year, you work the ground, you plow it, you sow, you prune, you harvest. And then for 1 year, you do none of the above. And then for 6 years again, you work the soil and you plow and you sow and you prune and you harvest. And then for 1 year, the Sabbath year, you do none of the above. And then the third thing about it is this, that it's slightly difficult to work out from our verses exactly what you can do in the land, on the land, in the Sabbath year. So you can't, verses 4 and 5, you can't sow, you can't plow, sow, prune, reap, harvest. But you can, verse 6, you can, verse 6, whatever the land yields during the Sabbath year will be food for you, for yourself, your manservant, maidservant, hired worker, and so on. So you can't reap or harvest, but whatever the land yields during the Sabbath year will be food for you yourself, and your workers, so on. Now, I think that the point is that while you don't sow anything this year, a certain amount will grow. We can think about 2 things there. The one is, remember, they were required not to harvest completely to the edges. They were to leave some fruit, some wheat, for the poor to come and help themselves. They would be left in the field, and there would be, and Olive isn't here to give us the real terminology, but there would be something like self-propagation. You know, the wind blows the seeds, and the seeds find a place, and they settle, and they grow. And like that, there would be some growing even in the unfarmed field. There would be some growing. And whatever grows by itself, you haven't sown it, but whatever grows by itself like that, don't harvest it, don't store it, don't sell it, but you can eat it hand to mouth. You, your servants, your family, your animals. So there's no farming, but there is a bit of gentle, immediate eating whatever happens to grow, that's what happens in the Sabbath year. And I think that's what those verses mean. There will be some unsown by you growing. And you can help yourself, hand to mouth, to that. Now the rest of the chapter, verses 8 to 55, are all about the year of Jubilee. So verse 8, count off 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbaths of years amount to a period of 49 years. Then have the trumpet sounded everywhere on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement, sound the trumpet throughout your land, consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. Now, a number of things about this. First of all, the word Jubilee. It is just an anglicized way of saying a Hebrew word. And the Hebrew word is the word for a ram's horn. In other words, the trumpets which would be blasted to proclaim the beginning of the year of Jubilee, the trumpets were ram's horns. And that's where the name comes from, the year of Jubilee, the year of the horn. The year of Jubilee was to be proclaimed, trumpeted, kept every 50 years. So you'd have that 7 years we thought about already, 6 years farming, 1 year no farming. You'd go through that cycle 7 times. And then you'd proclaim the year of Jubilee, which would be the next year, the 50th year. It would begin directly after the harvest of the 49th year. So you finish harvesting at the end of September, the beginning of our October. And then in October, we would say the 7th month from Passover, about April. The 7th month from then, on the Day of Atonement, you blast the trumpets. It's the 50th year now. You blast the trumpets to announce that this coming 50th year is the year of Jubilee. Third thing, the year of Jubilee was a year of freedom or liberty. The word I find most useful to catch the meaning is the word release. It's the year of release. And there are basically 3 parts to the releasing. First of all, like the Sabbath year, the 1 year in 7, on the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, there is no farming. So we could say we proclaim liberty, release for the land. The land is released from all the demands which are normally made of it. So verse 11, the 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. Do not sow and do not reap what grows of itself, or harvest the untended vines. Now, of course, that means there's going to be no farming that year for 2 consecutive years, because the 49th year is the Sabbath of the land. So you haven't farmed in that year, and now the 50th year you'll be asked not to farm again. And so the land is being released from all the normal demands that are made of it. Secondly, the people are released. Human beings, the Israelites. Verse 10, consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each one of you is to return to his family property and each to his own clan. Now you might think, what a nuisance. Imagine if we were all told, now go back to where you've come from. Leave your work, leave where you live, leave the place you've made home, and go back to where you're from. Imagine, I think we might think, wow, that is quite a difficult imposition. But if you read on, you'll see it's not like that. The people who are released at the year of Jubilee are the people who've hit on hard times. They haven't been able to feed themselves, their families, and so they've gone away to find work. They've found it, and they've become the possession of the people who've employed them. And these are the ones who are now being released. And there are a number of different circumstances in which this is going to happen. And chapter 25 anticipates how it'll work out in different cases. But here's one example, verses 39 to 43. If one of your countrymen becomes poor among you and sells himself to you, do not make him work as a slave. He is to be treated as a hired worker or a temporary resident among you. He is to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then he and his children are to be released, and he will go back to his own clan and to the property of his forefathers, because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. They must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. But it is the case with all these released inhabitants. They are people who've fallen on hard times, and they've needed to leave home and find employment, money, food with richer, more successful families. They become the possession of those families, but they must be released. The assumption is they'll want to be released. The assumption is that there is a deep yearning inside every human being for somewhere called home. And it isn't then an imposition. This is a wonderful thing, that they are being released and they may go home. But when they get home, the home that once they couldn't afford to keep, they couldn't afford to stay there, they had to leave it, it must be given back to them. The home must be released. This is the third release. The home must be released. Once upon a time, it was bought off you, or off your parents. But now, in the year of Jubilee, you go back and they will release it to you again. And that's the third kind of release, the release of your home, and the land that went with it are released for you when you go back. So, verse 13, in this year of Jubilee, everyone is to return to his own property. Well, we had it in 41. Then he and his children are to be released, and he will go back to his own clan and to the property of his forefathers. So the land is released, the people are released, the houses are released. Now, there are things in the chapter that fill out how it would work. For instance, when you buy some land, someone needs to sell up. They can't afford now to live there any longer. They must go and put themselves in the employment of someone else. But the price at which you buy their home, their land, is based on how many years there are left until the year of Jubilee. And that's such a bit like our leasehold. It's such a nice thing. In other words, if you're buying some land that goes with the home, you say, well, how many years, how many harvests will there be until the year of Jubilee? So more harvests left, you pay more. Fewer harvests left till Jubilee, you pay less. And we shan't read it now, but you'll see that in verses 14 to 17. Now, what ties the two things together then? The Sabbath year for the farms, the land has a Sabbath to the Lord, and the year of Jubilee, that 50th year. The point is, of course, as always in Leviticus, the tabernacle is among the people of God. And we're anticipating now, not in the wilderness, but when they're in the promised land in Canaan, the tabernacle is there, the Lord is living among his people. But the Lord does not only claim that small spot of land where the tabernacle is. That's a very holy spot. But he claims the whole land. The land is mine. And I'm associating that now, not simply with the fact that, Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. Of course the land is his. No, the promised land is his, like the rest of the world is not, over and above the rest of the world. The tabernacle is in the middle of the land. God is there among his people. He claims this land like he does not claim beyond how he claims the rest of the world as his rightful own. The land is mine. And of course, he does not only claim the land, he claims the people. The people are mine. And that's the thing now through Leviticus 25. The people are mine, not like all people are mine. These are my people in a special way. And so the point is then, the house you live in isn't yours. It's mine. The land you farm isn't yours, it's mine. The people you hire aren't your servants, they're my servants. And so notice that, and in some of these verses, verse 2, when you enter the land, I am going to give you, anticipating Canaan now, not the wilderness. When you enter the land, I am going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. Can you hear that? I'm giving you the land. In some sense, it's going to be yours, but it's mine, and it must observe a Sabbath. Verse 23, the land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine. When you sell your house, your land, you're only selling it until the year of Jubilee, and then it'll be given back because it's mine. It's mine. The land is mine. Verse 38, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. You see that I brought you out of Egypt. I've released you from being slaves. You're mine. And in those verses, just ahead of verse 38 there, you must not start treating one another as if you own one another, as if they are your slaves. No, you're all my servants. It's more explicit in verse 42, because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Verse 54, he and his children are to be released in the year of Jubilee, for the Israelites belong to me as servants. They are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So even when times were hard, and you looked for employment, and you gave yourself to be kind of the possession of some richer family, you were never their possession. You were always mine. And because you're mine, they must release you at the year of Jubilee. Now, I think there is a case for saying the land benefits from that year of Sabbath every 7 years. But that's not the main point. The main point is the land is the Lord's. And so the land owes its owner a Sabbath, because it's the Lord's land. Now, this reminds me, and that's rather a tenuous connection, I know, but it reminds me. I want to bring this into the present time. Living this side of Christ. Leviticus 25 reminds me of the book of Colossians. Now, in the book of Colossians, you need not look it up if you don't want to now. I'll try and summarize. In the book of Colossians, there are two big lessons that just control the whole letter. And the first lesson is this, that everything in this world belongs to Jesus Christ. Do you remember that wonderful piece there in the middle of chapter 1 about Jesus Christ? Everything in this world belongs to Jesus Christ. He made it all. He holds it all together. In him, it says, all things consist. And it's all for him. If I can just quote one sentence from Colossians 1, verse 16. All things were created by him and for him. In other words, whether you believe in Jesus Christ or not, whether you're a Muslim, whether you're an atheist, you are Christ's. And your house is Christ, and your garden is Christ's, and your money is Christ's, and your clothes are Christ's, and your time is Christ's. All things are his. In him all things consist, and everything is for him. Now, of course, that's where the unbeliever, the Muslim, the atheist, that's where this all falls apart. They are Christ's, and everything they have is Christ's. All things are his. But they are not holding all things for Christ. They're not giving their time back to Christ. They're not wearing their clothes for Christ. They're not eating and drinking for Christ. But Paul says then, and here's the second big lesson in Colossians, if you are a Christian, then this is how you live. All things are for Christ. Your eating and drinking is for Christ. Your hours are for Christ. You wear your clothes for Christ. You spend your money for Christ. Christ, or else, he says, you have become disconnected from the head. And you see that? What an impossible thing that is for a Christian, you'd say. And yet, Paul says it's possible. To be a Christian who's become kind of disconnected from the head, from Christ. In other words, you've got all these rules, he says, touch not, taste not, all these rules. And he says, but they've got nothing to do with Christ. Your rules have become the substance and the ceiling of your religion. You're doing all those things, they might be okay things, but in your heart, they've got nothing to do with Christ. You've become disconnected from the head. In other words, a bit like those ancient Israelites, a Christian belongs to God, not just like the rest of the world belongs to God. All things are Christ's, but you and I are Christ's in a different way altogether. He is our head. And that controls how we use all his things, the things he's given to us for a little while. We use them knowing they're his, and we must give them back. We give them back to him all the time. Now we can apply that in lots of ways. There are a number of folk among us, we're praying for them. They're very poorly. And this is what a Christian knows and how a Christian lives, and yet we need to be reminded. The Lord has given, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Do you see that? That my health is a gift from Jesus Christ, and it's his. And my life is a gift from Jesus Christ, and it's his. I live it for him. I hold it for him. And one day he takes it